Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, March 1977, President Jimmy Carter sat down at his desk in the Oval Office across from broadcaster Walter Cronkite in front of a speaker, which was connected to a telephone. And what did Jimmy do? Well, live on TV, he took phone calls from regular Americans for 2 hours. 9 million phone calls got made to the president in that window. He only had time to get to a dozen or so, but they were not really screened in advance, and it was this remarkable moment of unfiltered access and a really wide range of questions and interactions. In fact, I would argue that if you wanted the most efficient snapshot of American political life in this period, 1977, your best bet would just be to revisit the Dial a President broadcast on March 5th, 1977, because there is just everything in American politics jammed into that Q&A unfiltered with the president and Walter Cronkite. So let's do that. Let's get that snapshot. Let's talk about that Dial a President broadcast. Here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
The number, 900-242-1611. 900 numbers.
Yeah.
First off, it doesn't mean something. It's not like 900 dial Jimmy or whatever. It's just a number. But 900 numbers are not really out in the ether anymore. And if they are, they kind of have a seedy reputation.
I was going to say, aren't those sex numbers?
I was going to say, I was expecting something a little spicier than Jimmy Carter and Walter Cronkite.
Yeah.
Someone like misdialed, trying to call a sex line, and then they get the
just
president.
Heavy breathing for 20 minutes.
But apparently, there's a whole interesting backstory about how they came up with that number and the Ma Bell, the logistics of how they did it, and they had dispatchers throughout the country to even out the odds and the different regions of the switchboards and all this stuff. It is a semi-fascinating. I would pin it as semi-fascinating story of the logistics of how they put this together. But the big story is, why is Jimmy Carter open to this? I mean, we're living in a moment where I don't think any president would ever say, oh, yeah, I will take unfiltered calls for 2 hours.
Well, I think that it really is a snapshot of this very moment in U.S. history. Jimmy Carter ran for president as a populist, as an outsider. So it already feeds into that sense that he's a man of the people. And this is one way of showing he's going to have these conversations with the people. And it is also this period where trust in government has collapsed after the Vietnam War and Watergate. And Carter had also promised to bring transparency back to the White House. And what could be a bigger sign of transparency and openness than the president just fielding phone calls from the American people?
Yeah. It, to me, is sort of like, I don't know, just looking at the image of it, how when you watch podcasts today, you have the mic in people's phone and they're sitting in a living room or sitting in a room, that same feeling you see in the Oval Office, Walter Cronkite, and they've got their mics in front of them and they're just, perched on these nice, comfy chairs and just having a chat. I was like, little did we know, fast forward.
Right.
Decades later, people would be doing sort of the same thing. But what kills me the most about this is that it was not really filtered, in terms of who's calling in. I mean, somebody could have called in and said horrific things, and that doesn't happen. They're pretty much basic, general, honest questions.
Not one Baba Booey in the whole thing.
I know.
Seriously. Well, let's get to those questions and comments because I think they really do paint that picture. But, some of the behind the scenes, I think it was technically Walter Cronkite's idea. He came up with it. But I think Carter had been playing with, he tried to do some fireside chats. He wasn't sure, sort of fully sold on that. He was trying to push the agenda. This felt like, I mean, obviously telephones weren't a newfangled thing, but it felt like, something new, that we could try. One interesting thing, I mean, we are painting a responsible picture about how people took this and how civil they were in this discourse. But I will say that there's some quotes from the White House press secretary at the time, Jody Powell, another notable male Jody in history. But he has said that, like, we assumed that people would want to call in and be disrespectful to Jimmy Carter, but they would never be disrespectful to Walter Cronkite. And so I think they were assured by the fact that, like, Cronkite was sitting right there and no one was going to baba booey Walter Cronkite, whereas they may have with Jimmy Carter, which is another interesting snapshot of the era.
It is. And it's even that, even with that mindset in place, it is pretty remarkable that nobody gamed the system to get in. Although, again, 9 million people called in and 42 questions get through. So there may have been a bunch of pranksters and cranks and tricksters out there who didn't make it through. But the fact that this went off as well as it did is pretty impressive.
Yeah. The very first question, I went in and I looked at the transcript and I started reading through it. But the very first question, I think it's from a caller in the Midwest somewhere. It's about Idi Amin, Uganda. The invasion of Uganda. I mean, just right off the bat, just kind of like, okay, now you have to talk about that, and then the next question is going to be something, but it is kind of amazing. That was the first one. I think probably, to my mind, proves that it wasn't screened or scripted, because I don't think the White House would have said, that's the first most pressing question that we want to get on people's minds. But also a reminder that in that time period was a big foreign policy question. But it kicks off with a question about Idi Amin. What other kinds of questions get asked?
I mean, one caller calls in and asks him about Americans who had dodged the draft during the Vietnam War and his pardoning of them, which I think is interesting, is a good question to ask. And then some of the questions were more personal, not political, but, why did you put your daughter in public school? They live, obviously, in Washington, D.C., in a majority black city, and sending her to public school is not a decision that most white parents would make, certainly not the parents of presidents or the children of presidents. And so what sort of motivated that decision?
Yeah, that's, a personal question, but also, I think, deeply political. We should do a segment about that. I mean, that was a huge story that sort of said a lot about the way people saw Carter and saw the country at that point.
Yeah, and there were other deeply political questions as well. I mean, one woman called in, I think, with more of a comment than a question, and said that, she chided him. She kind of, criticized him for coming out in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment, which would have ensured gender equality in the U.S. Constitution, and just said, you're interfering with states' rights by urging legislators to pass this. So there were these
and when she said the phrase states' rights, a big red flashing
I know. I was like,
light went over Carter's head.
Klaxon goes off.
She said this? That's why I'm like, she? Just boggles my mind. But go ahead.
But I mean, others were also kind of silly. I mean, there were questions about there's a 13-year-old boy who calls in and it's like, well, there's this drought in the West. So why don't we just take all of the excess water in the East and put it in boxcars and ship it out there? And Carter, who is a technical guy, whose sort of encyclopedic command of everything is on display during this conversation, gives him a real answer. He takes the question seriously, which I think is another point in his favor. Yeah.
Yeah. And, he's not, I said, there's no screening, there's no prepared notes, and he does really basically handle every question. And there's also a moment where he really pushes back on folks, too. And someone calls in and makes a claim about a policy of his, and he's basically like, that's wrong. I don't know where you got that information. I think it was related to oil policy, and he's basically, I don't know where you got that. And the guy did the very 2024 equivalent of I saw it somewhere. He didn't say Facebook, but he effectively said, I saw it somewhere. And then Carter was like, well, I don't know where you got your information, but, I'm not in favor of that policy. And so, he really engages with folks. There was a moment about the Yankees were playing in an exhibition match in Cuba, which was a huge moment. And I think sort of Cuba and baseball and the geopolitical implications of that are a big through line throughout the 70s and into the 80s. I'm just really impressed by the range here, and then his willingness, I think, to engage. I mean, there's people who are taking him to task, but no one is foaming or yelling. I mean, and maybe it is that they don't want to do that in front of the saint, Walter Cronkite.
Yeah, or national TV.
Hosted by Lindsey Graham, Wondery's podcast American History Tellers takes you to the events, times, and people that shaped America and Americans. In the latest series, American History Tellers explores the Underground Railroad, a covert network of secret routes and safe houses operated by men and women committed to helping enslaved people escape bondage in the South. Follow American History Tellers on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts.
I also think there is something about the media culture at the time. This is a period before people really have cable, before you have Rush Limbaugh, before you have a lot of over-the-top, angry, shouty political media. You have a little bit, but you don't have a ton. And you add on top of the fact that this is a big national media event, you add in Walter Cronkite and the President of the United States, and people sort of like fall into that respect for not just the office, but for the media form itself. And they just don't, I mean, it's probably beyond their imagination for most people to have the kind of shouty attack conversations that we are so used to today.
I also think, given that 9 million people tried to call in, if you're one of the lucky 42, I mean, that's like winning the lottery, basically.
Right.
Like, I don't think you would want to sort of shoot your shot with a silly question. But
both of you have, done a lot of media. Have either of you been on the C-SPAN show where they have a line for Democrats and a line for Republicans and a line for independents,
Yes.
And, I always go back and forth. It feels very of a previous era, but it still exists now. And you get people calling in. And I mean, I don't know. What was your experience like, Niki?
I would say it's a mixed bag. Like, there are some very erudite and specific questions. I mean, people who are watching C-SPAN.
I mean, they watch C-SPAN, yeah.
Listen, if
they
you're
know what's
watching
going
C-SPAN, you're a reader.
But, in my experience, it was also a lot of misinformation. And also just a lot of, in my experience, I encountered some pretty gross sexism as well. So I didn't love it as a format. It's always interesting to color questions because you never know what you're going to get. So you have to really stay on your toes.
And your point about some of these were more of a comment than a question. I mean, it makes me think of when I was a producer on the Brian Lehrer show, and we would, especially during live events, we would open it up to let people have something to say. And I always told Brian as the host, I was like, look, we're going to open it up for questions. There's a microphone floating around. If you have something to say, raise your hand. We'll bring a mic to you. He's like, all I ask, this is the line I gave him. He's like, all I ask is that the words you say at the end of it, there's an actual question mark. There needs to be a question mark at the end of the words you say, as opposed to, but still people would ignore it. And
sure.
I think sometimes people get nervous and they just retreat to whatever. And these days they retreat to, as you were saying, misinformation and maybe not the best behavior. So one big question as we wrap this up, and we should say it was called, I think CBS technically called it Dial a President, but everyone, including Carter's official papers, refer to it as Ask President Carter. So as we kind of look at this, my big question is, we painted this picture of it being largely a success, largely civil, but it only happened once. What is your sense of why they didn't do more?
When you stand at half court and you shoot the ball and it swishes on the first try, you never stand on half court again. You maybe never touch a basketball again because you know what will happen. And so the fact that they made it through this unscathed strikes me as like a one and done
good.
kind of thing.
That's your
gonna
analysis?
be my answer. Yeah.
Yeah. Take your win and go home. That's it. And I mean, this doesn't become a thing that every president after him does either. It's not like a tradition where we all turn on the TV and listen for, the Ask a President show. So I think there's something to be said about that too, that there is this sort of drawing back, I think, of transparency and people's ability to sort of access the president in this way.
And this is also happening in the first couple of months for 6 weeks of Carter's presidency. And so the popular support for Carter is still pretty high. As you get deeper and deeper into a presidency, decisions become more controversial. You become more polarizing. And there's a chance that his advisors were like, maybe this isn't the time for the rest of his presidency.
SNL does spoof this, which is a nice little thing to go look up if you want.
It's amazing, and people should watch it.
And Carter, I think carries at least the spirit of this. He loved town halls, and in this case, he does reportedly circle back with 2 of the callers of the 24 who reached him and follow up with them by phone in the wake of this style of president. So, the spirit is in the air. But I think, once stuff gets a little hairier inside the White House, maybe they don't want to open the phone lines. Cronkite, by all reports, was very much wanted to do it. It was a rating success. It was a big moment for him. I think CBS was very eager to do it, but they never got the logistics together. All right. Well, I suppose we should leave it there with our Dial a President episode. That number again. Someone should go. I didn't try it. Someone should go try it. Listeners, your task. Dial 900-242-1611 and see what happens. I'd be very curious to hear.
I can tell you what's going to happen. It's going to be like, doo-doo-doo. The number you've reached has been disconnected.
Or we should just advise when they ask for your credit card number, when you dial that number, please hang up. We take no responsibility for what happens after that.
Thank you for that disclaimer. All right, Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Mr. President, our first call this week comes from Mrs. Edward Hoprat.
Hello, Mr. President. How are you today?
Very fine. Could you turn your radio down, please?
Oh, yes.
Mrs. Hoprat, do you have a question for the president?
Yes, sir. I'm an employee of the U.S. Postal Service in Kansas. Last year, they installed an automated letter sorting system called the Marvex 3000 here in our branch.
Yes?
But the system doesn't work too good. Letters keep getting clogged in the first level sorting grid. Is there anything that can be done about this?
Well, Mrs. Horvath, Vice President Mondale and myself were just talking about the Marvex 3000 this morning, as a matter of fact. I do have a suggestion. You know the caliper post on the first grid sliding armature?
Yes.
Okay, there's a 3-digit setting there where the post and the armature meet. Now, when the system was installed, the angle of cross-slide was put at a maximum setting of 1. If you reset it at the 3 mark like it says in the assembly instructions, I think you'll solve any clogging problems in the machine.
Oh, thanks, Mr. President. By the way, I think you're doing a great job.
I'd like to take this opportunity to say that none of these calls are screened.
Hey, Jody here. As you probably know, This Day is a member of Radiotopia, a network of original, creator-owned podcasts. What you might not know is that Radiotopia also has a monthly newsletter called The Citizen. It is packed with juicy details about new content, behind-the-scenes stories, upcoming events, and every once in a while you'll see a picture of a Radiotopia host and be like, oh, that's what they look like. So, if you love Radiotopia, you do not want to miss The Citizen. You can subscribe by going to radiotopia.fm/citizen. Thank you, and happy reading.
Radiotopia.